Welcome to Full Prefrontal, the show that exposes the mysteries of executive function. This podcast is a collection of conversations about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which impacts your focus, planning, problem-solving, emotional balance, and independence. So join us as we explore executive function and the science of learning. And now, here's your host, the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.
Welcome to another episode of Full Prefrontal. My mission is to help people understand that our brain's prefrontal cortex at its best produces behaviors and actions that are goal-directed, persistent, and highly focused in serving the need of the future self. The brain's PFC, or prefrontal cortex, acts as the orchestra conductor, directing actions, guiding emotions, tweaking responses, and calibrating decisions in order to create a beautiful, harmonious symphony of well-lived life. However, this is not accessible to every single individual. And because the brain is in the process of development, children are less capable until they become adults. But even within the developing brain in the child, some children have greater access to the advantages that come with a well-developed prefrontal cortex. So the question is, we cannot really understand the impact of brain that's able to guide itself without considering the context. And that's why I bring the guests who contribute to this process of uncovering or unveiling the key components that drive and propel the significant self-regulation in ourselves and continue to be successful. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest today. Our guest is Dr. Pedro Noguera, who is Emery Stroop and Joyce King Stroop Dean of Rossier School of Education and a distinguished professor of education at the University of Southern California. And I know you started there, I think, recently, if I'm correct. Before that, he has a long journey of amazing, successful career, including being at the endowed chair at NYU, Harvard, and University of California, Berkeley. He is an author of 15 beloved books. I haven't finished all of his 15 books, which is on my to-do list. I have finished 3 most important ones that I found extremely informative. And he also is a most important contributor to our educational leadership's understanding of how to create equity and really understand student agency. So welcome to the podcast, Dr. Pedro. I'm going to call you Pedro.
Yes, please. Great to be with you, Sucheta.
So I talk to a lot of my guests, and since we talk about executive function, I want to start by asking you, do you care to maybe reflect for a moment and talk about your own development as a student? And when you were a young learner, what kind of agency did you have on your learning? When did you discover the brain that guides and directs and manages learning? What would you say?
Well, I would say I was lucky because my parents strongly encouraged us to read independently. And I point out that neither of my parents went to college, neither graduated from high school.
Really?
But they sent all 6 of us to college, some of the top colleges in the country, Harvard, Brown, Cornell, Berkeley. And on Saturdays, after we would do our chores, we lived in Brooklyn, they would make us go to the library, as if that was a daycare center or something. But fortunately for me, there was a very nice librarian, a Panamanian woman named Mrs. McDonald, and she would take interest and she would talk to me and to the others about what our interests were. And when I was 8 years old, she recommended a book to me, A Wrinkle in Time. It's a well-known book.
That.
I made a movie about it not long ago. I would have never read that book because it wasn't my kind of book. I didn't like science fiction. There were a lot of things I didn't like about it. I liked Mrs. McDonald, and I fell in love with the book. And within a week, I was done. I was back ready for more. And that really put me on a journey to become an independent learner, because one of the things, we make it seem harder than it is. Our goal should be to encourage children to become independent learners.
Yes.
Right? Not dependent on the teacher. And reading is one of the ways to do it. And if you can cultivate in children a desire and love of reading early, then everything else gets a lot easier.
Wow, there's so many things that I can think of as I'm listening to you. First of all, congratulations to your parents, because they themselves sound like had some secret sauce about motivating their children to pursue or even discover the joy of learning and engagement. I would love to bottle that. So maybe you can tell us how they did that. But I do want to quickly tell you my personal story. I grew up in India. My mother was an 8th grade graduate. My dad was did not grow up with lower middle class, you can say, but did not have access to college. So went to college as he was working. But they both instilled deep love for learning. And one of the nerdy things we had in our house too is to go to the library. But the unfortunate part of the library that our town belonged to would allow one book per week. And I would finish that book on the way from library to home. So I would sit in the library and finish reading 3-4 books. And then the librarian, who turned out to be a little bit mean, but she discovered that I was not being faithful to reading. So, I was hogging all the books. So anyways, what's so interesting to me that your love for learning eventually translated into you taking deep interest in learning how to learn, sounds like. So you are a social scientist, if I may say so, and your interest is in the relationship between culture and society and individuals in the society and how that interplays. Tell us a little bit how is that interest has shaped your interest, how that interest has shaped your understanding of education, learning, and student agency.
So, one of the things we know is that what's happening outside of school in the lives of children, in the economy, in the political environment, in their culture, it also shapes their experience in school. However, it tends to be, especially in the United States, we don't recognize that very well. We kind of know it intuitively. We know, for example, that poverty will shape educational experiences for kids, but we do very little to address it. We know that culture shapes educational experiences for kids and influences how they learn things, but we do very little to address that. So it turns out that although context is clearly very important, as is culture, these are not topics that educators are well schooled in and know how to account for when teaching children. And so, the mistake I often see is we expect children to learn the way we teach.
Yes.
And if they can't do it, we blame the child or we blame their family.
Yes.
What we should be doing is teaching kids the way they actually learn. But to do that, you have to know those children. You have to know something about those children, how they learn, what they're interested in, what they're motivated by, what challenges they face. What I often say is the more we know about the children we teach, the more we'll know about how to teach them. But I say more often than not, all we know are stereotypes. And the stereotypes inform assumptions that are usually, particularly with poor children of color, influenced by deficit thinking about those children. And that actually gets in the way of cultivating the talents in children.
I think what strikes me about that is this idea that if you are coming from poor background, you don't have enriched life experiences. And to me, experience itself is enriching or enriched enough to teach so many things that may not be pertinent to the teacher's interest in students' learning, is what you're saying.
Absolutely.
Right? So can you tell us, what's a good way to tap into students' learning experience or life experience, and in the context as the teachers are trying to accomplish some goals that they have for learning? And so I'll give you a quick example. I think one of your students, Aninda Kundu, actually, I heard him talk about this. I think he's one of your collaborators now, but he was talking about the teachers in California who actually realized that the students were not engaging. So educational experts recommended that ask the students, do you have a backyard? What do they have? So they had access to their backyard. So they came up with this project to study lead content in their backyard soil. And then that became, based on their study, they actually came up with a proposal to send to their local district or my state legislative entity. That was brilliant, right? So how do you
Actually,
see?
Anindya got that story from me, but I'm glad he's sharing
Oh,
it.
was it yours?
It's
I
an
knew there was.
example.
He
What it
did say
is,
that.
it's an example of how do we make education relevant to the lives and experiences of children. So here's another example I just heard. A kindergarten teacher had the children outside playing in the yard, and one of the children found a dead bird. Well, children are extremely curious about animals and about death.
Yes.
So everybody was there looking, and they wanted to, can we touch it? What happened? How do you think it died? The teacher proceeded for the next 2 weeks to create lessons around the bird.
I love that.
They buried the bird. They talked about, what should we do with the bird? And they all agreed we should bury the bird and honor the bird. But they also spent time thinking about what could have killed the bird. And so they hypothesized about how the bird could have died. They talked about what does this bird eat? So they were curious. He tapped into the natural curiosity of children.
I love that.
What the research shows, when you tap into their curiosity, they'll become independently motivated learners.
Brilliant. So, and what you're saying is that can be a bird unit now. What birds eat.
It's an environment unit. It's a unit around biology and physiology. It's a unit around so many things that he brings together. Literacy, they're learning language, developing their language skills by studying something they're interested in. He tapped into, because he was wise enough to see,
yes.
These kids want to know about this bird. Let's use the bird as a teaching opportunity.
Brilliant. So why do we not see this more often? Where are we getting it wrong?
I think what we get wrong is we approach the children as if they come to us with empty heads, as if they know nothing, and that our job is to pour knowledge and skills into their heads. Wow. So we're going to teach them the alphabet. We're going to teach them their numbers and build a foundation so they can acquire academic knowledge. That, the one who realized long ago that was all wrong was Maria Montessori.
Yes.
And many people know of her work, as the Montessori schools are worldwide and well-renowned. What many people don't know is Maria Montessori was not an educator. She was a physician. She understood child development. And she understood that if you expose children to an environment that taps into their natural curiosity, their tactile, because a lot of kids are tactile learners, they like to touch things, they will learn on their own. And the teacher can become the guide of the learning. And anybody who's gone to a Montessori school sees the magic of it. Kids who are deeply engaged, right? Who develop strong concentration skills, strong executive function, the ability to defer gratification, the ability to work with others, all in the context of work that seems like play.
Wow. And to me, actually, the joy of that classroom, like imagine if you are in the zone where children are engaged because what they are engaged with is so curious, or it tickles their curiosity, but it also is going to make them problem solvers, curious investigators. Another thing I find, and tell me how this fits. One of the things that I get from your writings and your entire proposition to educators is this enriched teachers also invoking their own enriched experiences. To me, sometimes either teachers don't freely bring in their cultural experiences, or they're not really taking the time to build their own knowledge set beyond the classroom curriculum. And I'm not accusing them, but I just feel it requires, that's the kind of innovation we need to see. What do you recommend? How can teachers be brave and not think this is waste of time?
Well, it starts from teachers realizing how powerful they are.
Yes.
And I think many teachers don't see that. Because a lot of it, I don't blame teachers for this. I think a lot of times they come into a school and they're told, this is what you're going to do. This is the curriculum. We're going to watch you to make sure, and you better keep these kids under control. And so then they become fixated on control and covering material, not on tapping into the curiosity of children and empowering them as learners. So when I was a brand new teacher in Providence, Rhode Island, I was assigned to work at what was considered the worst high school in the city, Central High School.
Oh, wow.
And but I was excited. I was looking forward to it. I'm going to teach 11th graders American history. I loved history. So I was really excited about that. So my mentor teacher tells me, he says, your job when you teach American history is to get the kids from the American Revolution in the fall to the Vietnam War in June. That's your job. Here's the book. I'll be in the back watching. So I tell him, I said, well, what about the Constitution? Don't the kids need to learn the Constitution? He said, you only get a few days on the Constitution.
Oh my God.
Because the Constitution is complicated and you have to be at the Civil War by Christmas.
Oh,
I said,
my
well,
goodness.
the Civil War is really complicated. He said, you don't get it. You have to be at the Great Depression by Easter.
Oh my goodness.
Then I got it. He didn't care if the kids learned history. All he cared was if
Cover
I
the
covered
units.
the book. Well, did I cover the book?
Oh,
So
gotcha.
it was about breadth and coverage, not about depth of understanding. So, but fortunately for me, he wasn't in the back watching. He was off out drinking coffee or doing other things. So when the door closed, I had the power.
Wow.
And I'm thinking to myself, wow, this is a lot of power for a 21-year-old. But I knew what to do with the power, even though I was only 21. I said, my job is to get them to love history the way I do. So what that meant to me, I have to make history come to life. I have to get them to see why it matters. So I would do things like we would learn about something, like learn about a character from history, say Thomas Jefferson. They would learn about him. I say, okay, tomorrow, Thomas Jefferson is coming to class. And I would invite a friend to come in dressed as Thomas Jefferson. And the kids will come in ready with questions.
Wow.
To interrogate Thomas Jefferson and pose questions about slavery, for example, about his relationship with Sally Hemings, the young woman that he owned and fathered several children with. And then ask, how could you write the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, and treat your own children as slaves?
My goodness.
A higher order thinking skills.
Absolutely.
And I will bet you those students who went to the worst high school in the city will still know about American history because of that experience, because history came to life for them. And I think that when we can make knowledge matter and make it meaningful to our students, then it becomes something very different for them. School ceases to be an alienating experience and it becomes an empowering experience.
Okay, I need to go back and you need to go back to teaching so I can be a student in your class. You know, this style and this kind of immersive experience and this also questioning your assumptions as well as kind of coming, you made these things come alive. You know, I had Esther Wajiki on my podcast, and she's a Palo Alto teacher, and she told a very similar story of how she defied some of these expectations. She just had the students decide and drive their learning goals for themselves. And I do think that the courage that you're talking about comes from your own understanding of the history. So you were in your power, like your passion zone. I feel people are not taking the time to read enough sometimes, so they may not have the knowledge to share with great passionate stories about learning how to learn.
Imagine if we were to tell teachers, your job is to get the children excited about learning. That's your job.
Yes.
Right? What does that do to a teacher? It says, oh, then I'm going to have to be creative. To get them excited, I can't just go and talk. I've got to come up with ways to bring them in, to show them the power of knowledge. Yes. And if that's what they're doing, it looks very different.
Oh, so can I kind of take you back on this idea of how does sociology, what have you learned from cultures, whether the ancient cultures and cultures from other countries, that has informed your own understanding of education? So what are you seeing? What have we learned from looking at the history of humans in the context of larger groups? I know it's a little bit sidestep, but I think that is such an important way to think about learning, right?
So what we know is that culture informs how we learn. It also informs how we see the world, right? And so that's why when I said earlier, the basic, most fundamental question we've got to be able to answer is, what does it take to educate the children we serve? Who are those children? Well, as soon as you ask that question, you start to delve into the realm of culture, and you start to, what are their lives like outside of school? Who are the influences in their lives? How do they use literacy and problem solve? How do they adjust to challenges and respond to challenges that they face? When you start to look at it that way,
Wow.
I saw this, for example, when I was in Australia. I was talking to a large group of principals, and I said this very thing I said about the need to understand the kids. And one of the principals shared a story. He said he was teaching in a very remote setting, the outback, right? And mostly Aboriginal children.
Yes.
And it was so remote that he had trouble recruiting teachers because nobody wanted to live there. It was so far away. And the school was just doing terribly. The kids were not performing well on the test, the standardized test. And he was at a loss of what to do. And one day, one of the kids invited him to go fishing. He said, "Do you like to fish?" He said, "Sure, I like to fish." He said, "We're going to go fishing on the weekend. Why don't you come with us?" So he shows up with a big, fancy fishing rod to go fishing in the stream. And he sees the kids, all they have is string and paper clips that they're using to catch fish, but they're out fishing him. And so he puts his rod down and he says, "Okay, show me how you do it." And then as they're showing him, he has a revelation. How do these kids learn to fish?
Oh my
They
God.
didn't learn to fish the way we've been teaching them in school with somebody lecturing at them. These kids learn by doing. They learn by watching. To fish well, you have to understand currents. You have to understand the wind. You have to know when the fish are going to be there, what the fish like to eat.
Oh my God.
It totally changed his whole framework and the way he was viewing the children. And that's what we need to do in more schools, is reorient the framework away from focusing on what the children don't know to recognizing what they do know and building upon that foundation. Because as we build upon that foundation, we can, in fact, introduce children to new ideas, new concepts, new skills.
I'm blown away by that story. And this reminds me of, I'm going through my mindfulness meditation teacher training program right now. It's a 2-year commitment. And one of the
I'm a meditator too. I meditate too. My wife teaches mindfulness.
Oh, that's brilliant. I'm a long-time meditator and really have a tradition. I come from a Hindu tradition as well. And one of the stories that was shared in one of my classes was so heartwarming that a teacher in Hawaii went to a classroom, middle school classroom, and she asked all the children to talk about their gifts. And it came to one particular young boy who had obvious learning disabilities. And he pondered over this question, and he was quite troubled and felt really sad to share that he couldn't think of any gifts. And she felt horrible of even asking him. And then the class ended, and a couple of days went by, and then she had gone to a grocery store, and she saw the boy there with her family, and he came running to her. And he said, "I really," and she was a little bit embarrassed because she's like, "Oh my God, he's probably devastated that in front of the class, he had nothing to share." And she said, "I really, really am not good at reading. I really, really cannot write. And I was thinking about, but I want to share with you that I go to the ocean and fish come to talk to me." And she said, "Really? Tell me what do you mean by that?" He said, "Even sometimes sharks come and talk to me, but I tell them, I don't need you because I need the other fish. But I always tell the ocean, I will only take 2 for my family. I don't need all of them. So anytime I stand next to the ocean, all the fish come and only few I take with me." And she was just like your story. She was like, "What are you talking about?" So turns out he had this incredible knack of using some sounds to draw fish to the like even to a shallow part of the ocean. But anyway, that just reminded me that she would have never even gave him any credit. But what I'm getting from you though is this deep interest in human condition. You're inviting every person involved in education or interactions to take interest in other person's life.
That's right.
And what
That's
that
what education should do, is elevate the human condition.
Yes.
Right? Enable us as human beings to better navigate the world, to better, to learn how to live together so that we live peacefully and in harmony. And we don't think about education as doing that. We don't think about the role of education to be to teach us how to live.
Yes. Which is so
but
sad.
If you don't learn how to live, if you don't learn how to support yourself because of your education, then how useful was your education? My father, I mentioned a while ago that my father did not have a high school degree or a college diploma, but he was a very well-read person. He was also a very traveled person because he had been a merchant seaman. So he traveled all around the world.
Wow.
He could speak several languages. And before I went off to college, he said to me, you can get a free education with a library card. You know that. Right? That's what I've done. He says, don't go to college and become an educated fool.
Oh, wow.
Because the most important kind of knowledge you can't get in college, and that's common sense.
Wow. Yes. Yes.
If you think about it, what is common sense? Common sense is good judgment. Common sense is discretion. Common sense is knowing yourself and being able to read others. If you don't learn those things, you go through life making lots and lots of mistakes.
And again, I think to the point of our discussion, that executive function is nothing but common sense, this ability to use discernment, this ability to read between the lines, to infer and extrapolate from social context, as well as personal agenda compared to navigating the interest and needs of others. That dance that we do, that you can have a little, I can have a little, we both have, there's ample, the sense of abundance that comes. So nobody's coming from a place of deficit or a fear that there's a zero-sum game. So tell me, in your experience now, let's talk a little bit about equity. What is your definition of equity? And how do the challenges around the learning and teaching kind of are exaggerated by the issues of race, issues of differences that are hyper-focused, or preconceived notions, and people's lack of access to their own biases?
Yeah. So equity is simply giving children what they need to be successful in life, right? That is acknowledging, though, that what they need is not simply academics. They might need social support. They might need emotional, psychological support. And it's also based in a recognition that every child is different.
Yes.
Now, I often point out that anybody who has more than one child is probably practicing equity already, because you know that you can't treat them all the same because they're all different personality, different temperament, different needs. When we see the needs and recognize the differences amongst our children, then we start to acknowledge that we're going to have to provide different kinds of support for different children, because again, they're not all the same. What gets in the way are biases. Right? Biases relate to race, relate to class, culture, language, etc. The other thing that gets in the way is simply the tendency to blame the children when they don't learn something, or blame their families. And how often have you heard people say, well, they don't value education?
Yes. Right? Completely wrong. Yes.
And so these kinds of attitudes really get in the way of meeting the needs of all kids. But the good news is, and I always remind people this, I can point to schools in various parts of the world that serve all kinds of kids. And the existence of those schools is all the proof we need to know the problem is not the children. The problem is our inability to create the conditions that foster good teaching and learning.
Wow.
So I'll give you another story to illustrate that. I was in Alabama, a place called Tuscaloosa. Tuscaloosa is home to the University of Alabama. Great university, great football team, not great public schools. So it's an integrated city with segregated schools. So I go to Bear Bryant High School, a school named after a great football coach, an all-Black school, and I'm asked to speak to the teachers. And I'm talking about creating the conditions for teaching and learning. But I can tell from the looks on their faces, from their posture, that they're not buying anything I'm saying. And I said, how many of you have ever been to a school where you've seen Black children excelling?
Oh,
And no one
wow.
raised their hand. I said, you've never seen Black children who are excited about learning, who are motivated, who are doing well academically? I said, nope. I said, well, if you've never seen it, I bet you don't think it can be done, do you? And they said, that's right. I said, well, I'll challenge you to come with me. I can take you to schools where Black children are excelling. And to their credit, they sent 8 teachers to come visit me in New York City.
Oh my
I
goodness.
took them to a school called Medgar Evers Prep, named after the great civil rights leader. And they were blown away by the children, by the students, by their commitment to their education, by their passion, by what they were accomplishing. And it was interesting when I debriefed with them about the visit. They were saying, well, we'd never seen this before. This was so impressive. And what they started to realize, but didn't say it, is the problem wasn't the children. The problem was the way they treated their children.
Oh, wow.
How little they expected of them. Now, I don't think that simply visiting, because only 8 of the teachers went. There's still a whole nother 40 or so left behind. So can those 8 change the mindset of their colleagues? I don't know. But that's what we have to do, is change the mindset. Carol Dweck, whose work I'm sure you know,
yes,
talks about mindset, a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset. But she points out that if you want children to have a growth mindset, which allows them to see themselves as having the ability to learn something if they apply themselves, if they get the support and help they need, for that to happen, the adults have to have a growth mindset first. And if they don't, it's not going to happen.
Well, 2 thoughts come to my mind about this. One is, I think what you did for them is, again, one of the things I'm really getting a sense of how you're approaching is this incredible trust and compassion, even though they are coming from fixed mindset. So you're very patient and tolerant. I love that, tolerant. But what you really did is, how much ever you might have lectured them that, no, they're very successful people, you actually said, let me let you experience it. Experience is such a great teacher. And I feel that can only happen if we cross-pollinate, if we go into each other's communities, if we meet people from completely different walks of life. I think that's not happening enough. America is kind of living in a silo where people kind of become members of their own echo chamber. And I'm sure you have some thoughts about that. And second, just circling back to the topic of equity, the best way I like to explain when I talk about equity is, when my kids were growing up, I have 2 boys, and any dessert we would give it to them. The rule was, one will cut it into 2 pieces and the other one will have first dibs. So if you want to equal, you can decide to cut one big and one small, but the other one gets to pick it. That kind of instilled this sense that I need to think about, how will this be for the other person? And I think we are not doing that enough. But question about this idea that, let's just take, I was putting some stats together, which I don't need to share. You probably breathe in this space, but NCES sorted the 8th grade math achievement data between 1990 to 2015 and sorted it by race, ethnicity, and family income. And it showed that achievement gap between the students by the groups were narrowing, but it still continued to be wide. For the lowest performing gap was for our Black children. So this is a very different question. I feel if you put up a slide and showed it to educators, they probably are going to be aghast. But why does this understanding that it's not, I think, fully absent, but why does this not translate into changing into policies and actions and deeply seated structural changes? Like, when are we going to come to that place where this knowledge of disparity between the way achievement is working for students will change? How do you hopefully think about this?
So so what I did in that example I gave of going to that school in Alabama was I created dissonance for those teachers, right? So I shook up their assumptions about their students by showing them Black students who are thriving and excelling. So they changed the way they were thinking about it. We have to do that more and more and more. because the way we have, so think about it like this. In any society, a group that's been hated, a group that's been oppressed, usually doesn't thrive. If Black students were excelling in America, given they have the highest poverty rates, the highest unemployment, the highest rates of homelessness, that would be amazing.
I know.
Right?
It'll be all their grit, in quotes. No, I'm just kidding.
But think about it.
Yes.
Despite all those hardships, you look at the accomplishments of Black individuals in the arts, in music, in literature, and we can go on and name outstanding individuals, many of whom came from impoverished backgrounds.
Yes.
So what we know is that there's talent in those communities. But here's the problem. In this country, unless you have talent in athletics, right, you're fast, you're strong, or your ability to get the opportunity to develop those talents will be very limited, because it's going to be limited by virtue of what kind of school you attend. Yeah. And in this country, we tend to give kids from impoverished communities an impoverished education. So imagine if there's a town in Florida called Belle Glade. Belle Glade is just a little bit to the west of West Palm Beach, which is a very affluent community. But Belle Glade is very, very poor and predominantly Black. Many of the houses don't even have indoor plumbing. But it's produced more professional football players than almost any town in America. Now, why is that? Well, it's because we love football. And so coaches know that there are kids in that town who run fast, who are strong, and who with the right training could become excellent football players. Well, suppose we said, you know what? I bet you there are some potential scientists in Belle Glade, and there are potential writers and artists and doctors in Belle Glade. Suppose we took the same kind of approach to developing talent in communities like those. You won't do that if you believe, and that's the American mindset, that there is no talent there.
Yes.
Those people have nothing but problems. I often point out to Americans, why is it that in every city in the United States, large or small, there's almost always a Black ghetto? But if you go to Canada, there are no ghettos.
Wow.
You can go to Windsor, Ontario. Windsor, Ontario is right across the river from Detroit. Okay. Detroit, as we know, is a dying city, predominantly Black.
Yes.
Lots of poverty, lots of problems. Across the river is a thriving Black community. In fact, many of the residents of Windsor were formerly enslaved people who escaped to live in Windsor.
Oh, wow.
They live in lovely homes. They do well in school. They go to universities. Why is it that in Windsor, the community is thriving, the Black community, and in Detroit, it's dying?
Oh my goodness. Expectations.
Opportunities.
Yes.
Historic racism.
Yes.
So if you don't confront these issues, nothing changes. And so this is the dilemma for education. Education in the United States reproduces inequity. It does not, for most people. There are exceptions. I'm an exception. There are many others who are exceptions. But the basic pattern is we're reproducing patterns of inequity. Those who start out poor, stay poor.
Stay poor, yeah. The zip code destiny, yes.
That's right. How do you disrupt that? You only disrupt that if you not just put money, you can't just put money into a failed system. You just get more failure. You have to change the whole paradigm, the whole way in which we think about what we're doing.
Well, I'm so glad that you're sharing actual examples of success, because it's not a dream. It's not an aspiration. It's not like a utopia. One day we'll get there. You're saying we are doing it in so many places. We're just not consistently committed to doing it in every place.
Exactly.
And do you think it's a lack of imagination on educators' part, or it is many, many things? I don't mean educators.
It's also a lack of will. We just did a study on the state of Black children in Los Angeles. And we showed that even as the numbers of Black children decline, the hardships keep going up. We also showed that not only are they doing poorly in school, but they have the highest asthma rates, they have the highest rates of food insecurity, highest rates of homelessness, highest rates of children in foster care. But then we asked a different question. Where are Black children succeeding in LA
What's the
County?
answer?
So we looked at the schools that send the greatest number of Black students to the University of California. Most of them are integrated schools with lots of resources. Problem is, not many Black students get to go to those schools. However, we found one school that's almost all Black. Well, it's actually Black and Hispanic, and it's located in Watts, called the King Drew Academy. King Drew sends more Black students to the University of California than any school in Los Angeles.
What are
What's
they getting it
different
right?
about it? It has all the opportunities. Kids, it has laboratories, it has internships, it has an enriched learning environment.
Oh my
So
goodness.
now we say, well, then why is there only one? Why aren't there several like that? Why do we accept such an inferior education when we know that the cost of not educating kids is significant? Because those we fail to educate are the ones we're more likely to incarcerate, are the ones who are more likely to end up unemployed or unemployable. So it lack of will, lack of imagination, lack of vision. It's many things.
And lack of actually powering those initiatives with money. So, that 2019 Ed Builder report came out, and that showed like majority of white districts received 23 billion more than majority to non-white districts. I mean, that's really putting your your money where your mouth isn't aligned with some other mission. And their
Right.
driving force is definitely different.
So money's part of the answer, but it's not just money. It's about how the money is used.
I see. Well, so as we end this conversation, do you kind of think? Oh, how do you think? Where do you feel hopeful? As you talk about connecting communities, focusing on human connections, that's another one of the books that you co-authored. I love that whole approach that you're talking about. And it's not kumbaya, because it's almost often like people condescendingly talk about kumbaya. It's such a great concept. You know what I mean? So how do we stay hopeful, committed to excellence, and never stop with effort? How do you envision if everything was going your way?
My hope is that the pandemic provides us with a moment to reflect on how to make it better, right? This disruption has slowed everything down, and many of us, myself included, I'm saying, my life was not good before. I was traveling too much. I didn't spend enough time with my family. Because of that, I didn't sleep as well. I didn't eat as well. I didn't exercise as often. Now I need to take more control. I'd say that similarly, we have to think about schools that way. We can't just go back to the way it was, because the way it wasn't working for many kids. We need to make it better. We need to make it more equitable, more engaging, more supportive of our children. And if we could do those things, but for that to happen, we've got to let people know it's possible. And that's why I think what you're doing with this podcast is so important. Get the word out that we don't have to settle what we have right now.
Well, brilliant. As we end on that note, what are you, author of 15 books, reading? What's inspiring you? And what should I really read to enrich my life so that I can begin to think like you?
So I started reading a book called Making All Black Lives Matter. It's actually by a friend of mine, Barbara Ramsey. She's an historian at the University of Illinois, Chicago. I'd recommend it because, if you look at what's happened, just that simple term, Black Lives Matter, evokes so much fear.
Yes.
Right? So that now they say, that's a terrorist organization. They want to make Black Lives Matter.
Oh my goodness.
Think about the irony of it, right? Because they believe Black lives don't matter, shouldn't matter.
Yes.
So I'm reading it, trying to get some perspective on that, and trying to find ways to be able to talk to others so that they could also realize, humanity, our ability to thrive as a species is limited when our neighbors, when those around us are not thriving. And that's what we wrote about in that book, The Crisis of Connection. The other thing I just got today is something I'm a dean now at USC, and this is written by one of my professors, Adriana Kizar, called Envisioning the Faculty for the 21st Century, and really about how to create a learner-centered model at the university.
Oh, I love
that. So, I'm looking forward to this. I still enjoy reading. I read all the time. I read probably about 4 newspapers a day.
Oh my God.
So I think it's still the best way to get a free education.
Oh, I love that. Do you speak multiple languages like your dad?
I only speak English and Spanish. That's it.
Well, that's still multilingual for America, let me tell you. One quick question I did not ask you. Is the story different in college? You're talking about, are our college students living an inspired learning life?
By college, the students who get to our elite institutions have been socialized to learn that way. So they can learn through lecture. Right?
Yes.
They can learn from a boring professor, right? Because a lot of the learning they're taking responsibility for. That's at the elite universities. When you go into the less elite and the community colleges, what you find is unless you see passionate, creative instructors, often the quality of learning is not very good. And so we have a lot of work to do in higher education as well.
Well, with that note, I cannot tell you how inspired I feel. Thank you for your contribution to the field. And thank you for really taking such a deep look at the needs of our children and our students, because learning shouldn't depend truly on the teacher's commitment to teaching. It should be, their commitment should be because they care about what they're bringing to their students, and students it's infectious to me. If you're in company of a person who's inspired by their own discovery of what they're talking about,
it's infectious.
It's so infectious. Yes.
That's right. Let me just share one last thing. I do have to go in 3 minutes. So the way I continue to work on my own executive functioning.
Oh yes, tell me.
Is through cooking. I cook. And what I enjoy about cooking is it involves multitasking.
It does.
I'm cutting vegetables, I'm cooking the rice, I've got many things happening at once. And it's a great way to escape from the day, to kind of clear my mind. So it's meditative as well. So, cooking and gardening are my two of my hobbies that I find great joy in. And so I'd encourage listeners to think, what are your hobbies? What are your interests? How do you give yourself not just a break from your daily routine of work, but also a way to cultivate other talents in yourself?
I love that. And I have to quickly tell you, this is going to go on and on. I apologize. But I had a documentarian who interviewed me and followed me as executive function expert. And he came to my house. He came to my office. He has not published it, so I don't know where it is. But he came to my house, and I have the most organized pantry you can see. And I was telling him the story of, if you want to really master your executive function, learn to cook. And teach children cooking. Cooking should be an integral part of task management, your intention management. I mean, cooking is the most amazing way to serve the need of others. Think about, you're not eating, you're feeding.
You're serving, right?
What a beautiful way to be.
You got to be thoughtful, but what am I serving them? Right?
That's right.
Does it taste good? And I often say, good teaching is like good cooking.
Oh, I love that.
How do you know you're a good cook? The people who eat it tell you. How do you know you're a good teacher? Your students will tell you.
Yes. Well, okay. So you have a standing invitation to come and see me in Atlanta. I know we are in a pandemic, but I am going to feed you. Yes. Right. This is such a pleasure. Well, thank you for tuning in, everybody. What a great conversation. And I will be putting show notes to all the writings of Dr. Noguera. And once again, keep your frontal lobes attuned, because it does require attunement and alignment. So thank you for joining, and please listen to our next podcast. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Full Prefrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive function. To contact your host, Sucheta Kamath, and learn more about her work on improving executive function, visit her website at exqinfiniteknowhow.com. That's www.exqinfiniteleknowhow.com. Tune in next week for another informative episode of Full Prefrontal, hosted by the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.